Picture the parable of the sower the way most of us grew up hearing it. A farmer walks a tidy field. There's a path along the edge, like a garden lane. A few rocks here and there. Some weeds in a corner. Good, soft soil everywhere else, just waiting for seed. It sounds less like farming and more like landscaping. That picture is almost entirely wrong, and it's wrong in a way that changes what this parable is actually saying. The real fields Jesus was describing sat on the hills of Galilee, and archaeologists who have excavated that region describe a landscape closer to a survival test than a garden. Thin soil sitting directly on cracked limestone bedrock. Field tracks pounded rock hard by daily foot and donkey traffic. Thorn roots that never fully died, waiting underground for the next rain to come back to life. And a farming method so different from what we picture that most modern readers get the entire opening scene backwards before the parable even starts. Here's the detail almost nobody catches. In a lot of first-century Galilean farming, the sower didn't wait for a plowed field at all. He often scattered the seed first, walking across raw, unbroken ground, and only plowed it under afterward. Which means every single bad landing spot in this story, the path, the rock, the thorns, wasn't the result of careless throwing. It was where the seed was always going to land, because the ground hadn't been sorted out yet. This parable shows up 3 separate times, in Matthew 13, Mark 4, and Luke 8, which alone tells you the early church thought it mattered enough to preserve carefully in more than one gospel. And in every version, Jesus tells it standing at the edge of exactly this terrain, to a crowd who worked this exact ground for a living. Once you see the real dirt under this parable, the bedrock, the rain calendar, the hard-packed track, it stops sounding like a gentle nature metaphor and starts sounding like something Jesus' audience would have recognized immediately. Their own working year, described back to them with total accuracy. Start with the ground itself. The hills of Galilee are limestone country. Farmers across the region built terraces into steep hillsides by hand, stacking loose stone into low retaining walls, one field at a time, just to catch and hold what little topsoil rain and erosion had built up, because flat, deep soil land was scarce and valuable. Underneath a lot of that hillside farmland sits solid bedrock, sometimes cemented into an especially hard limestone crust that geologists working in Israel today still call by its local name, nari, a naturally hardened calcium layer that can sit just a meter or two under what looks, from the surface, like ordinary dirt. A study of the terraced landscapes of the Judean and Galilean highlands confirms this pattern across the region. Shallow soil pockets sitting directly over rocky bedrock, with almost no natural irrigation. Nearly all of this farming depended entirely on rainfall. There was no river system running water to these hillside fields the way there was in Egypt. Archaeologists working a Galilean farmstead site dated to roughly the 2nd century BC found exactly the kind of small-scale operation this parable assumes. Iron farming tools, storage vessels, evidence of a working household economy built entirely around a single growing season, growing the same staple grains, mainly barley and wheat, that show up throughout the Gospels. Researchers with the Biblical Archaeology Society, who documented the site, describe it as a farm essentially frozen in time, a physical picture of the same conditions Jesus' listeners farmed in a century or two later. Clearing and stacking the stone for even one terraced field was itself a season's worth of labor, passed down and maintained generation after generation, which is part of why good, deep soil was never something a farmer could simply go find more of. It had to be built, by hand, over years. Now for the method itself, because this is where most modern readers picture the wrong order of events. We assume a farmer plows first, then sows into neat, prepared rows, the way a garden gets planted today. But across a lot of first-century Palestine, the standard method ran the other way. The sower walked out across ground that hadn't been broken yet, broadcasting handfuls of seed by hand in wide arcs across the whole field, path and rocky patches included, and only afterward brought a simple wooden plow through to turn the soil and cover what had already been thrown. Scholars studying the historical background of Jesus' parables, going back to Joachim Jeremias' classic study of the subject, point to exactly this regional farming order as the reason the parable makes agricultural sense at all. It's not a story about one careless farmer scattering seed onto ground he could clearly see was bad. It's a description of the only method available to him, on a field where the danger spots were, for the most part, invisible until the seed was already committed. That single detail changes the entire opening picture. The seed that fell along the path wasn't the result of bad aim. The path cut across or along the edge of the field, and a sower walking his rows in wide sweeping arcs was always going to send a portion of his handful across it. The seed that landed on rocky ground wasn't overshooting either. A thin skin of workable topsoil could sit directly beside, or right on top of, a shelf of exposed limestone that looked, from a standing height, exactly like every other patch of dirt around it. There was no way to see the danger coming. You'd only find out once the plant started dying. This is the same kind of digging this channel keeps doing. Not adding drama to a familiar Bible passage, but removing the modern assumptions sitting on top of it. Words like Selah, parakletos, even sozo, kept turning out to hide a more specific, more historically grounded reality than the flattened version most of us grew up picturing. A parable about farming works the same way. Once you know what first-century Galilean dirt actually looked like, the story stops being a vague metaphor and starts being something closer to a field report. If tracing familiar Bible passages back to the real, physical world they came from is useful to you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. So walk through what actually happened to each handful of seed, because 2 of these 4 landing spots get flattened into the same idea in most popular retellings, and they were not the same problem at all. Start with the path. In a Galilean field, the path wasn't a decorative walkway put there on purpose. It was whatever strip of ground people and animals actually used to get in and out, cutting across the field or running along its edge, pounded down day after day by sandaled feet and the hooves of donkeys until the dirt compacted into something closer to a dirt road than soil. Seed landing there had nowhere to go. It sat exposed on the surface, and within hours, birds picked it clean. That's not a metaphor for hardness of heart layered on top of the story later. It's a literal description of what happens to a seed on ground that's been walked flat. Now the second landing spot, and this is the one modern readers most often confuse with the path, rocky ground. This wasn't the same hard-packed dirt. This was a place where a thin, deceptive skin of real, workable topsoil sat directly on top of a shelf of limestone bedrock. In some parts of the region, that hardened calcium crust geologists call nari, sometimes just a few inches down, sometimes closer to a meter. From standing height, walking across it with a handful of seed, there was no visible difference between this patch and the good soil next to it. The grass on top could look identical. The seed would sprout there faster, even, than seed in deeper soil, because shallow ground over rock heats up quickly in the sun. But the moment the plant needed to send roots down looking for water, it hit stone. With nowhere to go and no reserve of moisture underneath it, the young plant scorched and died the first time the sun turned hard, which in the hill country of Galilee didn't take long at all. 2 completely different failures, both invisible until it was too late. One a road, one a trap hiding under a deceptively normal-looking patch of dirt. The third landing spot, thorns, worked differently again. This wasn't empty ground competing with nothing. Thorn bushes common across the region kept root systems alive underground even after the visible plant had been cleared or burned back the season before, the way stubborn weeds do in any climate. Seed landing there wasn't just competing against weeds that hadn't sprouted yet. It was competing against an established root network, already deeper and stronger than anything a new seedling could grow in one season, drawing up the same limited rainwater the new plant needed. In a dry farmed field with no water to spare, that competition wasn't a close contest. The older roots won every time. And then, finally, good soil. The deep pockets, built up terrace by terrace, where centuries of erosion and careful hand labor had collected real depth, free of rock, clear of established roots, able to hold on to rainwater instead of losing it in a single dry week. This was the smallest category of ground in a typical Galilean hillside field, not the largest. Getting a seed into deep, workable soil wasn't the default outcome a farmer could expect. It was the rare win, and every farmer in that crowd would have known exactly how many seasons of stacking stone it took to earn a patch of ground like that. Put back together, the 4 soils in this parable aren't 4 equally likely outcomes randomly scattered across a peaceful field. They're 4 specific, well-known agricultural risks that every farmer in Jesus' audience had personally lost seed to, in that exact order of familiarity, on that exact terrain. There's one more piece of this landscape that makes the whole parable higher stakes than a modern reader tends to assume, and it has nothing to do with soil at all. It's the sky. Farming in first-century Galilee ran almost entirely on what's called dry farming, fields fed by rainfall alone, with no river system, no irrigation canals, nothing like the engineered water networks that kept Egypt's farmland productive on a schedule a farmer could actually control. What Galilee had instead was a rainfall calendar with almost no flexibility built into it, and it had names for both halves of it. The early rain, yoreh, arriving around autumn, which softened the sun-baked summer ground enough to plow and sow at all, and the latter rain, malqosh, arriving in spring, which filled out the grain heads in the final weeks before harvest. Sowing itself typically began around the middle of that autumn rainy season, and the barley harvest that followed the spring rain usually started in mid-April, a fixed, unforgiving calendar with no room to renegotiate. Miss either rain window, or watch either one come in weak, and there was no backup system. No canal to open, no well deep enough to save a hillside field. The entire year's food supply for a household rode on rain nobody could summon and nobody could stop. That's the pressure sitting underneath every single seed in this story. A first-century listener wasn't hearing a farmer casually toss grain around with nothing much at stake. They were hearing a description of the single highest-stakes gamble of their entire working year, on terrain that offered no real margin for error, thin soil over rock, a foot-worn path slicing through the field, root systems lying in wait, and a rain calendar that could turn any of those 4 landing spots into either a loss or, in exactly one case, months of food for a family. Every farmer listening to this story had almost certainly lost a real harvest to at least one of these 4 exact failures. This wasn't an abstract illustration to them. It was last year, which is what makes good soil land so differently once you know the real terrain. It's not the automatic, default outcome, the deep, rock-free, root-free ground healthy enough to actually hold onto the rain that fell and produce something with it, was the smallest, hardest won category of dirt on the entire hillside, and everybody in that original crowd knew exactly how rare it was to farm well. Jesus wasn't telling a story where 3 failures are ordinary and 1 success is expected. He was describing a field where every single planting was a real risk, where 3 of the 4 outcomes were the normal, expected result of farming this specific ground, and where the 4th, the improbable, hard-earned harvest, was always going to be the exception worth paying attention to. That reframes the ending too. Some fell on good soil and produced grain, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times, isn't a tidy conclusion tacked onto a nature lesson. Against this terrain, against this rain calendar, against 3 well-known ways for a season's seed to fail before it ever had a chance, a 100-fold harvest was as close to a miracle as farming in these hills ever produced, and everyone in that crowd, standing on ground exactly like it, would have known that better than we do today. There's a reading of this parable, developed by Middle Eastern culture scholar Kenneth that lines up closely with everything the terrain itself is telling us. Bailey argued that part of what this story is describing is a sower who scatters seed generously across ground he already knows is imperfect, the path, the rock, the thorns, and all, rather than waiting for perfect conditions that never actually come. Read against the real dirt. That's not a farmer being careless. It's closer to the only realistic way to farm this specific hill country at all, and it turns the sower's wide, seemingly wasteful scattering into something closer to earned, clear-eyed generosity than blind optimism. So here's where the real dirt leaves us. The path wasn't a garden lane. It was ground pounded flat by daily traffic, with no chance for anything to take root. The rocky ground wasn't the same problem wearing a different name. It was a hidden shelf of limestone waiting a few inches under a deceptively normal patch of soil. The thorns were an already established root system fighting for the same scarce rainwater. And the good soil that everyone remembers as the successful ending was, on this terrain, the rarest outcome of the entire field, never the guaranteed one. None of that changes the spiritual meaning this parable has carried for 2,000 years. What it changes is how sharp that meaning actually was to the people who first heard it, standing on hillsides exactly like the one in the story, with a bad harvest sitting in living memory for almost every person listening. This wasn't an audience that needed the danger explained to them. They needed to hear that, against all of it, a harvest was still possible, and that the sower kept scattering seed across the whole field anyway. Next time you read this parable, it might be worth picturing the real ground under it. The rock, the rain calendar, the worn path, instead of the tidy garden version most of us grew up picturing instead. Which of the four soils surprised you the most once you saw the real terrain behind it? Tell me in the comments. And if tracing familiar Bible passages back to the real world they came from is something you'd like more of, subscribe for the next one. Thanks for watching.